Hello and welcome to Africafé, the broadcast that aims at bringing to light African organizations and issues. Today we are talking about Caribbean states and their link with the African continent and heritage. But before joining our guest, let's take a look at this issue.
Afro-Caribbean people are Caribbean people who trace their full or partial ancestry to Africa. In some Caribbean countries, African languages are spoken, like Igbo and Yoruba in Cuba. These languages are also spoken in some South American countries, such as Brazil. Both the home and diaspora populations have produced a number of individuals who have had a notable influence on modern African, Caribbean, and Western societies. They include political activists such as Marcus Garvey and C.L.R. James, and writers and theorists such as Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon. The main Caribbean countries where Afro-Caribbean people live are Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Cuba, and Trinidad and Tobago. Afro-Caribbean history is rich in being studied across the globe. Most Afro-Caribbeans are the descendants of captive Africans held in the Caribbean from the years 1502 to 1886 during the era of the Atlantic slave trade.
Hello, Ambassador Len Ishmael. You're a professor, you're a geographer, and also an ambassador to Eastern Caribbean states, to the Kingdom of Belgium and the European Union. It's really an honor to have you here. Today, what I want to discuss is Afro-Caribbean states. I think it's a concept, or it's a notion that here in Morocco we're not very familiar with. So my first question would be, what are Afro-Caribbean states? What do they represent? What do they stand for? I think your perspective would be welcome.
Thank you so very much. First of all, allow me to say what a pleasure it is to be back here, not just in Morocco and Rabat, but in this house, the Policy Center. I feel very, very much connected to this place. Of course, I'm a senior fellow and have been for quite some time. I visited the Policy Center in its new home several years ago. I have watched the journey from being incubated as an idea to growing to something which is amazing and very, very significant as a portal for the Global South. And I can't say enough about how proud I am to be part of this journey and this exciting venture. So thank you very much for your hospitality and for being here. Just a slight correction. I'm always a little bit startled to hear that I'm a geographer. Yeah. That was my first degree. I was still a teenager. Okay. My career has gone on from there to being a young urban planner in New York City, okay. But also, of course, in the world of diplomacy with the United Nations, and then as an ambassador representing several countries to the Kingdom of Belgium. So it has spanned different occupations. But geography is not bad.
It was pretty interesting when I read your bio to see geographer, because you don't see that often. So I really wanted to bring that up. But of course we are here to talk with you with your etiquette or with your capacity of ambassador and your diplomatic experience to talk about the Afro-Caribbean states. So I think if you had to explain that to someone who never heard of Afro-Caribbean state, what would you say?
It's interesting because, as a matter of fact, that backdrop of geography is everything, because it speaks to why the name and why the term. Afro-Caribbean states, and it's not often that I see that language and that terminology as well as Caribbean states being called Afro-Caribbean states, because the Caribbean is a fusion of many, many influences. Of course, if we take a look at the wider Caribbean, which comprises about 39 million people, of whom the populations of Cuba, Haiti, would be among the biggest, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, but then all of the tiny islands, many of which I represented as well, fall into that mix, yes. And Afro-Caribbean would be the terminology we would give to the culture and the cultural heritage of perhaps 65–68% of Caribbean people whose direct ancestry is, of course, from Africa, particularly the western part of Africa, been moved there all these centuries ago as part of the slave trade. And the descendants of that particular wave of very early movement, I wouldn't call it a migration because it was forced.
It was a forced migration.
It was forced, absolutely. A forced dislocation, displacement. People in the Caribbean are very, very proud of that linkage. But people in the Caribbean also look all different shades. Another important component of the Caribbean population is also Indian, not as big as the Afrocentric population. And we find Indian populations more concentrated in certain countries like Guyana, like Trinidad and Tobago, for example, and some in the smaller islands, where you might find almost
Suriname
a 50-50. Suriname, where you might almost find a 50-50 split in the population.
Between Afro-Caribbean people and...
and that plays very directly into the political...
politics.
Absolutely, it does. And then there are every shade in between, because the ancestors of our people also come from Madeira in Portugal, they come from Spain, they come from...
So we wouldn't talk per se or exactly of Afro-Caribbean states. Would rather talk about Afro-Caribbean people.
We talk about Afro-Caribbean people, and scholars in the Caribbean like to speak of the Caribbean civilization. Of course, it's young, really, but like to speak about it in this way. But there's not a particular route. The central route is African. And there are other impulses as well.
The linkage between Africa and the Caribbean states are people, and those people carry a certain culture that is derived from the African continent, and they bring that to the Caribbean area and the Pacific area also, because I think there's also Caribbean states in the Pacific Ocean, right?
And not Caribbean states; they're also island states in the Pacific Ocean.
But they are part of a big organization that you represented, the
AOSIS. AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. And this particular alliance generates quite a lot of focus when we speak about climate change, because that was probably the biggest impetus behind the design of the alliance itself.
I saw that the alliance was very vocal on climate change. There were a joint declaration. They were requiring for fundings. There's some collaboration with the European Union, but what I want to ask you before we delve into climate change, because obviously it's kind of the elephant in the room.
Absolutely.
Do the alliance of these states, the Caribbean states, and also the islands from the Pacific, have some kind of connection or collaboration with African organizations or the African continent at large?
Absolutely, and if we can take them separately and together. But I'd like to step back a little bit and take a look at history, because before African countries were independent, and Caribbean countries as well, there was a lot of coming together over ideas around social injustices that we shared in common. One was the notion of colonialization, the other was racism, the other was apartheid. And the Pan-African movement was born. The Pan-African movement was not inspired in Africa, but rather the diaspora outside of Africa, in the Caribbean, in parts of Africa. And I think the first meeting of the Pan-African movement was in 1900 in London, from student activists. They were African, they were from the Caribbean, they were from different parts of the world. And one of the earliest participants to those meetings went on to inspire the civil rights movement in the United States. And that Pan-African movement was very, very vocal in fighting for the end of apartheid and colonialism, and the end of colonialism and racial injustice. But at that time, I would say that the diaspora worked very, very closely together. At the time of Ghana's independence, the impetus for the movement moved back to the motherland, to Africa, and a lot of work was done around that. But if we come forward now to the present day, the sort of very structured, collaborative approach to big ticket issues of social governance and issues that really concern us as a global South, as countries of the South.
Exactly, yeah.
We don't find that coming together in the way that one would expect based on earlier traditions, in a structured way. We have ad hoc, non-structured ways of staying together, and I'll just mention two very quickly. One was a recent conference by CARICOM, which is the regional community of some African state, Caribbean states, and that was to talk about African-Caribbean relations. And one of the works that I had published 3 years ago, published by our center here, is called The African-Caribbean Relationship Underinvested. And I speak to that history, and I speak to my own sense that there's much more that we should be doing. Sporadically, presidents and prime ministers from Africa and the Caribbean visit each other, but there is not a structured program of what that means and what we should be doing together.
Whereas there should be a program.
And there should be, because clearly when you think of the growing heft that Africa has, the fact that we represent so much of a population, the fact, too, that so much of our diaspora is now resident in the centers in which decisions are taken which profoundly affect our lives and our futures, we should be using that diaspora in a much more political way to advance our own expectations for our future.
But also because you clearly set a link, and you clearly presented that strong link that spans from history, from an ancient past to the present between the Caribbeans and Africa. Not only because a lot of the population of Caribbean states identify with African culture and have this link through forced migration, but they still today represent and are proud of this culture, and it represents an immaterial link, a very strong one. And also something very interesting that I didn't know is that there's a strong heritage of Caribbean states in the Pan-African struggles. And this is something very strong. It's a very strong political idea that we should put forward as a global South and say that in history we fought together for our independence, and today we can still fight together for our global challenges. And that brings me to my last question and the elephant in the room. It's climate change. As we all know, the COP26 just ended in Glasgow. African states and mainly poorer countries were quite disappointed at the outcome of the conference. And here in this discussion, we can clearly set a link and say that Caribbean states and African states can collaborate together and can have a common voice, especially in this topic of climate change, because they are on the front line, and they are the countries most at risk with climate change and its consequences.
And their footprint is so small. Yes. Their contribution is so small. Their
contribution is so small in terms
of
Africa, CO2 emissions and
absolutely. Africa, I think, with so much of the world's population, contributes less than 3.5% of carbon emissions, which is tiny, right? And of course, the Caribbean islands and other islands in the Pacific.
A lot of them have less than 1 million population, so I don't think they contribute a lot to deforestation or climate change or pollution.
Absolutely, and in fact, the countries that I represented as Secretary Director General of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and then went on to represent 4 of them as ambassador to Europe. The populations are micro. St. Lucia, one of the largest, has a population of only 185,000 people.
But still, they are at risk. Their island could be flooded, basically. This is what the risk we're looking at.
And more than that, I think part of the risk that we face in Africa and certainly in the Caribbean and other parts of the world is the fact that we are facing much more by way of extreme events. So in Africa, the droughts are longer and more persistent and more often. In the Caribbean, hurricanes are much more extreme, much more early.
And we've seen
in the
that
season.
globally. I mean, with the floods in Germany and in Europe.
Unprecedented.
Yeah, the fires everywhere in Turkey. So climate change is clearly real. And we are clearly concerned as part of the global South because of the implication for us and our capacity to cope with it. So my last question to this very interesting discussion would be, what can we do to collaborate more? What can we do to raise a common narrative against climate change, us African states and Caribbean countries?
I would say that climate change is one, but there are others as well. Issues of development, issues of financing for development, issues of debt, especially now that we're trying to recover out of COVID, which seems to be with us longer than we ever expected. I mean, these are also big ticket issues for us. I think that there are several things we need to do. First is that we need to rebuild the linkages that existed before us. People-to-people exchanges are absolutely key. Yes, we find each other at the UN General Assembly, at the WTO, around issues as they emerge, but these are transient. We need to build much more by way of permanent structures for the engagement of a type that is really substantive and not transitory. One of the institutions that could do that is the African-Caribbean Pacific Group of Countries, the ACP. I was also an ambassador within this grouping of 79 countries and president of the Committee of Ambassadors. And that institutional mechanism provides for the joint articulation of work about all the reasons, the Pacific, the Caribbean, and Africa.
It could be the ideal structure.
But it hasn't done a very good job institutionally, and I'm not saying it's an institutional failure, it's a failure of the institution, but the members as well, failing to focus on doing more together to advance a common narrative, a common agenda, to common problems.
Exactly. This is really my concern. Is how we can put forward a common narrative, because obviously it's stronger in the international community when a group of states, Caribbean and African, comes with one and only narrative and a common objective. Obviously, it helps.
I think you need leaders who are convinced that this needs to be done. In the Caribbean, there are one or two who focus are given greater focus to these issues, one of whom is the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, and she is very much concerned and focused on that relationship between the Caribbean and Africa. But more leaders on both sides need to be able to say, annually we need a summit of heads of government of Africa and the Caribbean. We need to have a plan of action that we follow systematically, and it can't just be sporadic.
Thank you very much. I could expand this discussion for a further hour, but because of the format of this broadcast, I'm going to have to close the discussion now. I thank you very much, Ambassador, for this discussion, and looking forward for our next exchanges.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure.
To know more about Caribbean countries, you can consult our website, policycenter.ma, and stay tuned for our next broadcast.